Yes, Miss Thompson.
Professor Dawson, before lunchtime we were talking about the samples that you analysed using the SEM microscopy and the EDXR.
Pixie.
Thank you. And I'd like to move on now to ask you about the results of your analysis. And you have prepared a number of slides that visually represent the data which you received as a result of using this particular type of analysis. I wonder if we might go to slide 32, Ms. Kell. So this slide is headed up Trace Elemental Composition Silver Strip Area 1. So Area 1 was the bottom of the silver strip on the back of the vest. PC Short's vest compared with all footwear samples. So that's Mr. Bio's 4 samples and the 2 from Constable Walker's shoes, all replicates. So that's 6 correct. Replicates per sample. So 1 vest sample compared with all of the footwear samples. Can you explain to the chair what it is that we see on this graph?
So if we look along the y-axis, so that is up the y-axis, that gives us the relative amounts, so in terms of composition, of the various elements that were found within each individual sample analysed. So if we focus on here on the x-axis, if you could remove the last second.
Professor Dawson, we can also do arrows if that would
Arrow might be
help
better
you. I wonder,
for
can we use the arrow function? I think what you do is put your finger on the screen and drag.
Okay.
I think.
Okay. Try that. So the y-axis is the relative amounts. So the larger, the higher the bar is, the more relative of that particular element there is in a sample. Along the x-axis, and here we've got the 6 replicates from Area 1 on PC Short's vest, so the lower edge sample at the bottom of the silver strip. And within each of the 6, so if we get a little number 3, if at the cursor point, if you could point to those 6 samples where above number 3, above the number 3. So that is one of those rectangular areas that were analysed from the Area 1 silver strip. And there were 6 of them analysed. And for each of those 6, they're represented by 9 different coloured bars. Each bar represents an element. So the dark blue one on the left is sodium, orange is magnesium, grey is sulfur, yellow is potassium, blue is calcium, green is titanium, dark blue is copper, brown is phosphorus, and purple is manganese. And it's always in that same order. So for each of the 6 replicates, which is denoted by the number 2 arrow, that's the 6 replicates, you can see each one of them potentially have any number of elements present, and they are represented by different colours. And I think you can see by looking at the silver strip sample Area 1 that within that same sample there's a lot of variation. So not all subsamples, not all replicates look the same. You can immediately see that the first 4 are more similar to each other by the relative amounts of the colour and which elements are represented than the last 2, replicates 5 and 6. Replicates 5 and 6, where the number 4 is sitting, are different to the first 4 replicates. So that is a heterogeneous sample, which might lead us to conclude that it could be a mixture of sources, that particular sample from the vest. And by looking at these profiles, the 4 look more like a soil. They've got a range of elements that are commonly found in soil, while the replicates 5 and 6 have got, they're dominated by the elements sulfur and some sodium and calcium. So we have to look for similarities in patterns between these range of elements, between these sample and all the other samples from the footwear. So I think you can see, hopefully, that if we focus on those last two, these samples here, those two replicates here, they are similar to these replicates here. But also, they are similar to some of the material here. Oh, sorry, there. So this suggests that these also might have mixtures within those samples. And if we look then at the more soils, the replicates 1, 2, 3, and 4 from the silver strip, they are more similar to some of these replicate samples there. So we're looking at each individual area that is measured and looking for commonalities of patterns in terms of the elements that are present in those samples. So this leads me to conclude that this question sample area 1 is a mixture of sources, probably two sources, with there being some of that material likely sharing a common origin with some of the material from the heel of the sole, well tinner, or toe of the sole of Mr. Bayo's boot, while the replicates 5 and 6 could have shared a common origin with the welt at the toe of Mr. Bayo's boot, but also with some of the sample replicates from the toe of the sole of P.C. Walker's left boot.
Thank you. Looking at the replicates for Area 1 on the vest, as you've already explained, 1 to 4 have certain characteristics in common. 5 and 6 look different. And 5 and 6, I think, have relatively high contributions of sodium and sulfur, as do some of the other replicates that you have drawn a comparison with, namely those at the welt at the toe of Mr. Bayo's right boot and the toe of the sole of P.C. Walker's left boot.
That's correct.
Can you offer a view as to what might have caused these relatively higher contributions of sodium and sulfur within some of the replicates?
Well, sulfur is an element that is emitted in the exhaust of vehicles, and it's known to accumulate within organic matter on the road or on the soil. So it adheres to that, and it's higher in a city environment. It's found much less in urban environments where you don't get vehicle traffic. Sodium is also found in road-type materials. Road salt, for example, sodium is a component of sodium chloride. So those could have come, we can't say definitively where they have come from, but they could well have come from that type of anthropogenic, human-induced origins.
So where we see these high peaks of blue for sodium and grey for sulfur, a possible explanation is that these particular replicates have a degree of influence from the road surface itself.
That is correct.
In your report, you explain that replicate 6 from Area 1 on the vest is what you call an outlier. I wondered if you could explain what is an outlier?
An outlier is a replicate that is different to most of the other examples within that population. So it's more different, and statisticians often disregard them. I mean, I presented all the data here, but they often decide that they are an oddity that is not explained by the rest of the data, so they can sometimes decide to exclude them from further analysis because they're different. They could be an artifact or something.
Is it unusual to have an outlier within your replicates?
No, I'm not surprised that there is an outlier. It just suggests there's a heterogeneous sample and it's not likely a single source sample.
So the sixth replicate you consider is likely an outlier. The fifth may have an influence from the road surface itself. And as you've already said in your evidence, within Area 1 of the vest, replicates 1 to 4 are visually more similar when we look at the data as it's presented in this graph in front of us. And you explain in your report that the first 4 replicates have wider elemental profiles that are more characteristic of soil.
That's correct, and they've got a wider range of particle sizes, sand, silt and clay, as we saw from the morphology. And also these elements that we see there, the magnesium, potassium, calcium, titanium, they are found in elements. They are the elements that are in certain minerals that are in basaltic parent material. If we go back to the geology, and actually the drift material is based on a basaltic bedrock around the area of Kirkcaldy. So it doesn't surprise me that we're seeing these particular elements in the soil at that location.
You've explained that there are similarities between replicates 1 to 4 from Area 1 in the vest, with the samples from the heel of the sole of Mr. Bio's right boot, the inner welt of his left boot, and the toe of the sole of his left boot.
That's correct.
And I think we can see that, can't we, just by looking at the data as it's presented in front of us. However, replicates 1 to 4 are different from the sample taken from the welt at the toe of Mr. Bio's right boot, the toe of the sole of Mr. Walker's left boot, and the heel of the sole of PC Walker's right boot.
That's correct.
And you said earlier that the conclusion that you would draw from this data as it's presented is that replicates 1 to 4 of Area 1 from the vest may share a common origin with the heel of the sole of Mr. Bio's right boot and the 2 samples taken from his left boot.
That's correct.
You also, in your evidence, drew a comparison between replicates 5 and 6 and those at the welt of the toe of Mr. Bio's right boot and the toe of the sole of PC Walker's left boot. And would you consider that this data allows you to conclude that they too may have shared a common origin?
That's correct.
Am I right to understand that your analysis involves both the assessment of the data produced as a result of this elemental compositional analysis and also the conclusions drawn during your visual examination of the soils, in particular using the SEM?
Yes, that is correct.
And so far as replicates 5 and 6 are concerned, looking at this data alone, you have drawn a comparison between those replicates and the toe of the sole of Constable Walker's left boot. Does that analysis stand after you take into account the visual characteristics as you viewed the soil samples under the microscope?
Well, when we look at the morphological characteristics of that sample, the toe of the sole of PC Walker's left boot, it was much more restricted, it was more sorted. There were larger grains within that sample. There were none of the finer clay or silt-sized fraction, whereas the soil material, for example, on the heel of the sole of Mr. Bio's boot, had a wide range of characteristics, including the finer grain particles, which also, those areas 1 to 4 on Area 1 in the silver strip had that wide range of morphological grain sizes.
So should we understand then that replicates 1 to 4, which you've compared to the heel of the sole of Mr. Bio's right boot and both samples from his left boots, not only have a similar elemental compositional profile, but they were also visually similar when looked at under the microscope.
That's correct.
Whereas replicates 5 and 6 from Area 1 on the vest, although they appear to bear some similarities to the sample from the toe of the sole of Constable Walker's left boot, they were distinguishable visually when you looked at the samples under the microscope.
There were only 2 of the replicates on the toe of the sole of PC Walker's boot that shared those characteristics. The other replicates didn't. But yes, I would say as well that those were morphologically different to the ones on Area 1 silver strip.
Thank you. Can we move on to slide 33, please? And here we see trace elemental composition, silver strip, Area 2. So that's Area 2 of the vest compared with all of the footwear samples. So this graph is exactly the same as the one that we've just been looking at,
Yes.
except for the fact that the replicates from Area 1 on the vest have been, thank you, replaced by the replicates from Area 2 on the vest. Is that right?
That's correct. It's the upper bit of the silver reflective strip.
So on viewing these results, what can you tell us about Area 2 on the vest?
Area 2, again, we've got one which might be termed an outlier here in the third replicate, in that it has a very restricted profile. It only has representation of the sodium and the sulfur, whereas the other replicates, 1, 2, 4, 5 and 6, are all relatively similar to each other. So apart from that one outlier, as it were, the other replicates are fairly similar to each other. So we can conclude from that it is likely, in general, a single source sample rather than a mixture.
Did this data allow you to compare the soil from Area 2 on the vest with the footwear samples?
Yes, that was the purpose of comparing now the results for the profile from Area 2 with all the samples of soil that were recovered from the footwear.
What conclusions were you able to draw?
I concluded from this examination, which considered also the morphology and the grain size and shape, as well as the elemental composition data, that none of the traces of soil could have come from any of the soil on that vest at Area 2. Could not have come or shared a common origin as any of the footwear samples that we looked at. They were different.
Can we move on to slide 34, please? So we see here trace elemental composition, the silver strip, edge of yellow fabric, that's Area 2. And again, this is a comparison of Constable Short's vest, Area 2, with all of the footwear samples, but using mean values. That's mean as in average.
That is correct.
Values. Can I begin by asking why you didn't prepare a graph like this in relation to Area 1?
Because I concluded that was likely a mixture, so that means are not a good way of representing what is a mixed sample. I would only present and interpret a profile that was a mean profile if it was predominantly a single source sample.
And you told us earlier that you reached the view that Area 2 was likely to be a single source sample.
Correct.
So what do we see here?
It just makes it a bit simpler to compare the profile of that Area 2 sample with all the other profiles, the 4 that were from Mr. Bayo's boots here, and the 2 that were from Mr. Walker's boots here. And the soil on the Area 2 is different to all the other mean profiles that you see here.
So this is just a simplification, essentially, of what we saw in the previous slide, using the mean data rather than looking at the replicates
That's
individually.
correct, yes.
Can we move to slide 35, please? Trace elemental composition, area 3 on the vest, that was the yellow fabric, and it's a comparison of area 3 with all footwear, all replicates. So we've seen this graph before, twice, and the only difference is that we are now looking at area 3 of the vest rather than area 1 or area 2. There we are, the area 3 replicates. Thank you very much. On viewing these results, what can you tell us about the soil sample taken from area 3 of the vest?
So if we look at the 6 individual plotted replicate profiles, the second replicate is slightly tending towards being different, but you would still include it within the analysis. But in general, those are relatively all similar to each other. So this is a homogeneous sample, which again leads to a conclusion or an interpretation that it could well be a single source sample. So it's likely not a mixture of sources.
Is that what homogeneous means, that
Yes.
it's single source?
That's correct.
And on viewing these results, are you able to compare the soil sample taken from area 3 with the soil samples taken from the footwear?
That's correct. And what we look for are differences in relative heights and composition of the elements. And if we look at the welt of the toe of Mr. Bayo's right boot, you can see that they are all different. The relative amounts are different. The different elements there are different. So I would conclude that you can exclude that soil as sharing a common origin with the soil from the fabric, area 3. And similarly, you can look at the toe of the sole of PC Walker's left boot, and again, you can exclude that as sharing a common origin with the soil from the yellow fabric, area 3, because these profiles are consistently different. And if you look at the heel of the sole of PC Walker's right boot, again, that profile is different. And I would conclude that you can say that it does not share a common origin with the soil from the yellow fabric, area 3.
Okay. So on the basis of this data as presented before us today, you were able to exclude both of the soil samples from Constable Walker's boots as sharing a common origin with the soil taken from area 3 of Constable Short's vest.
That's correct, both on the elemental profile composition and also on the morphology of those samples are being different.
What then of the remaining 3 samples from Mr. Bayo's right boot and the 2 samples from his left boot? How do they compare to area 3?
They are similar to the replicates from the yellow fabric, area 3, and cannot be excluded as sharing a common origin with that soil. In both the chemical profile compositions that we see here and also in the morphological grain size composition that we saw earlier.
When you say they cannot be excluded as sharing a common origin, is that another way of saying that they could have originated from the same source?
Yes, but in forensic soil science, we can't say things match because, as I said, there is as you can see, there is variation within soil. So you would never get a physical match. That's why we exclude things of sharing a common origin or say the evidence supports that they could have shared a common origin.
And does the evidence support there being a common origin?
Yes, that is correct.
So you say you cannot exclude the 3 samples from Mr. Bayo's boots as sharing a common origin with the sample of soil on area 3 of the vest. And in your report you say However, it is possible that soil sample vest area 3 may be similar to soils from other places, and comparison with other soils can put the comparison to question samples in the context of alternative source locations. This was not possible in this case due to the passage of time since the incident. Can you explain what you mean by that?
So when we're comparing a question sample, the soil from the yellow fabric area 3, so we don't know its origin, we're comparing it with the soil from any of the alternative propositions of the soils from the 2 pairs of footwear. So an alternative proposition is that could the soil that was on the vest in this area 3 have come from similar origin, or indeed the soil that was from the heel of the sole of Mr. Bio's right boot, the welt of the inner of Mr. Bio's left boot, and the toe of the sole of Mr. Bio's left boot, or alternatively have come from the soil from PC Walker's left or right boots. That's our only alternative proposition that we have available to us to consider. Now, that's because we cannot say that that soil definitely came on the vest, came from Mr. Bio's boots, because there could have been other sources of that soil on the yellow vest. There could have been another source. We can't categorically say it matches. We can say it shares the morphological and the elemental compositional characteristics, and that it could have shared a common origin, but we can't say it's come from there. We can only comment on the traces and their characteristics. We cannot actually say that it's definitely come from that place.
So the most that you can say is that the soil on area 3 of the vest is consistent with having come from the heel of the sole of Mr. Bio's right boot, or either of the samples from the left boot.
That's correct.
Can we move on to the next slide, please? What do we see here?
So that is just focusing in on the soils, the soil from the vest in area 3, and comparing it with the 4 soils that were recovered from Mr. Bayo's boots. So it's narrowing down on that source comparison, and you can see that the soil from the welt at the toe is different, while you can see again in more detail that there's a high degree of similarity or comparability between the soils that were on the heel of the sole of Mr. Bayo's right boot, the welt of the inner of Mr. Bayo's left boot, and the toe of the sole of Mr. Bayo's left boot, with the yellow fabric area 3 on PC Nicole Short's vest.
Can we move to slide 37, please? So trace elemental composition, area 3 of the vest compared with all footwear samples, and again using the means, which is possible for the reason you explained earlier, that it appears that area 3, the area 3 sample, is homogeneous. It's from a single source.
That is correct.
What does this data presented in this particular format help us to understand?
It just simplifies that profile so that you can see that this sample can be excluded because it is different to that of the yellow vest on the left, and these two are different. So they've got a different profile, and different relative amounts of several of the elements are present in those samples are different. Whereas the 3 samples here are similar to that of the yellow fabric in area 3 from PC Nicole Short's vest.
So this is just a simplified visual representation of the data that we looked at a moment ago, using the means rather than the individual replicates.
That's correct.
Can we move to slide 38, please? Mean trace elemental compositions from area 3 on the vest compared with the samples from Mr. Bayo's right boot, the 2 samples there. Again, what does this information, which I understand is the same information as we've already considered, represented as a pie chart rather than as a bar graph, what does this help us to understand?
Having the data represented in a bar chart, because it's compositional, allows us to look at the relative contribution of the different elements to that sample. And you can see with the same colours represented for each of the elements that were found in these samples, that the sample from the welt at the toe of Mr. Bayo's right boot is different. It's got a different composition, much more of sulfur within it and much less of the magnesium, the soil-bearing elements in it compared to the Area 3 PC shorts vest. However, when we look at the pie chart of the heel of the sole of Mr. Bayo's right boot, you can see that most of the elements there have got a similar proportional representation as the elements within PC shorts vest area 3.
So does the information displayed in this particular way help us to understand the similarities between area 3 of the vest and the sample taken from the heel of the sole of Mr. Bayo's right boot in particular?
That is correct.
Following on that, can I just ask you about the yellow fabric? It appears to have 2 additional elements. Do you have any comment to make about that?
Yes, and that was on only a couple of the replicates that those elements were found in, and it could well be that they have come from some exterior source. So that vest was, it was treated with chemicals, it was washed, and during that process, some of these could have been introduced to that sample. So there would never be an absolute, as I say, an absolute match of all the same elements, and they were found in a very, very small amount, a trace amount. So it could have been that someone brushed past it and or another piece of clothing brushed past it. It was a small amount and it wasn't in all the replicates.
Thank
so
you.
yes, thank you for picking that out. That is a very valid point.
I think, Professor, it's phosphorus and manganese. Are those the 2 additional elements that we see in the
Yes, that's correct.
in the pie chart for the vest?
And that could have also have been on the vest prior to this as well. From out on operations, particles of gunshot residue, all that sort of thing could easily have pre-contaminated areas of the vest.
So should we understand that the absence of phosphorus and manganese from the welt at the toe and the heel of the sole of Mr. Bayo's right boots doesn't concern you, nor does it undermine the conclusions that you have drawn?
Yes, and because there is such trace levels.
Can we turn to slide 39, please? I think we're returning to the microscopy here. Can you explain what we see in this slide?
So these are the morphological images using the scanning electron microscopy. And these are images from, on the left-hand side, the left boot of PC Walker, and at the foot of the left-hand side, the right boot of PC Walker. And as you can see, these, again, are well-sorted samples so that we only have the larger particle size grains in that sample. So these are the sand type size particles present on PC Walker's boots, on the soles of his boots. Whereas Mr. Bayo's boots, the left boot, had a wide range of particle sizes from the sand size through the silt right through to smaller than you can see at this magnification. And also on the left boot, this was the other sample. Again, just those two for representation, but again, this is not a well sorted, it's a wide range of particle sizes. And when we compare all those four, for example, and we did this with every image that we took across every of the 6 replicates for each of the analyses, and they were consistent. This was the sample from the vest, and it had this wide range of particle sizes from the sand right through to the fine clay in the vest sample. This was vest area 3, whereas the fine particles were not in box number 1 and 2 on the boots of P.C. Walker.
What should we take from this visual representation of some of the samples?
Well, that's an independent confirmation that because of the differences in the morphology of the particles that were on the traces found on P.C. Walker's boots, that they were different to the morphology of the particles that we saw from the yellow fabric on P.C. Short's vest for area 3, while the soils that were recovered, all 4 traces from Mr. Bayo's boots had that wider range, including the clay fraction on those samples.
So we've discussed the analysis that you carried out, and you've talked us through the conclusions that you felt able to draw based on a combination of a visual study or comparison of the images seen using the microscope and also the relative elemental compositional analysis. Before we turn to your final concluding slides, which set out your conclusions succinctly, I wonder if I could ask you a few questions about the involvement of a statistician in this case, because I understand that having carried out the visual examination and having considered the relative elemental profiles of the samples and reached the conclusions that you shared with us, you instructed Dr. Nicholas Church, a statistician, to analyse the elemental compositional data. And I'm keen to understand why you thought that was necessary or appropriate in this case.
Well, as we've seen, we've observed physical characteristics and also chemical characteristics of these wide range of samples. But potentially that's me interpreting and you interpreting by eye when you look at these visual representations of the data and of the images. Statistics are an important objective way of looking at that same data, but without any interpretation of the visual representation. It takes the data as it is. The reason I didn't do the statistics myself, which I often do if we've got gas chromatography data, for example, because it's fully quantitative, absolute amounts of different compounds across a whole range of compounds, and compare that multidimensional data, a question sample with a known sample. However, in this case, it was complex data because it was compositional data, and therefore I thought it was much more value to the inquiry that a senior statistician would independently look at my data and evaluate it using a quite sophisticated statistical model.
Is this something that you've done in previous cases, brought on board a statistician?
Yes, when there's quite extensive data or where it involves complex data, then I would ask of my statistical colleagues if their expert knowledge could be brought to bear and to carry out that appropriate statistical evaluation. And they would act as independent expert witnesses in the relevant court cases.
What information did you make available to Dr. Church?
I shared with him all the data, including outliers, absolutely all the raw data he had available to him.
So he had access to the elemental compositional data from all of the samples.
That's correct.
Did you provide him with images like the ones we see on the screen in front of us of the samples underneath the microscope?
No, he only had the actual raw elemental composition data.
Did you provide him with your thoughts or conclusions as to whether any of the samples might have shared a common origin?
No, felt it best to do the analysis totally independently so that he knew nothing of my conclusions when he was carrying out his examination.
As we discussed at the outset, Professor, Dr. Church has prepared a report and also given a statement to the inquiry. They are available to the chair and the assessors, and they will be published on our website, and so we don't need to concern ourselves with the detail of those documents. But what I would like to ask you is this: how did Dr. Church's conclusions, which I understand were fed back to you, how did they fit with your own conclusions?
On the whole, they supported my conclusions in the general evaluation, and in particular, the strongest comparison and evidence was that from Area 3, the yellow fabric on the vest, with support for that sharing a common origin with certainly 2 of the source samples from Mr. Bayo's boots, and with some support from a 3rd trace from Mr. Bayo's boots, and excluding the soil from PC Walker's boots as being the source of that soil on the yellow fabric.
Thank you. Am I right to understand that there might have been one point of difference between you in relation to the soil recovered from Area 1 of the vest, insofar as you found similarities between Area 1 and the soils on Mr. Bayo's right boot, and you also noted some similarities with soil recovered from Constable Walker's left boot, and Dr. Church reached the same conclusion in relation to the soils on Mr. Bayo's right boot, but also considered there was a similarity with the soil on Constable Walker's right boot.
And that was because Dr. Church was taking only the elemental data, and I think he also concurred that that was likely a mixed sample. It was a heterogeneous sample. And if we think back to the charts that were presented for Area 1, where that was a mixture with the replicates being quite different, with 2 of the replicates having the high sulfur and high calcium, I believe, they also shared those characteristics of being high. So a couple of the replicates from PC Walker's boots had those similar characteristics. So some of the replicates from Mr. Walker's boots did share the similar profile to that of Area 1, as did some of the profiles of Mr. Bayo's boots. So I think that explains it, because it's a mixture, so that there was a contributory factor from 2 sources to the soils that we're seeing, or even more, that we're seeing in this particular investigation. But what Mr. Church didn't have was information about the morphology and the differences in the grain size and shape that we could see between the soil on Mr. Walker's, PC Walker's, soil, and that of the soil that was on the vest. They were different.
So were you able to resolve that difference between you on the basis that you had additional information which informed your analysis, namely the visual images such as those on the screen before us, whereas Dr. Church was dealing with raw statistical data?
That is correct.
And whereas he might have identified a similarity on the basis of that raw data as between the soil on Constable Walker's right boot and the soil on Area 1 of the vest, you were able to exclude them as sharing a common origin on the basis of them being morphologically different.
Yes, that is correct.
I want to move on now to your concluding slides in which you set out your overall opinion. having examined the samples in the way that we've discussed, visually and under the microscope, having the benefit of the relative elemental compositional analysis and also Dr. Church's statistical analysis. So if we could begin with slide 40, please. Can I ask you simply to read out this first opinion slide?
So this, first of all, is in relation to Area 1, and the soil from the silver strip on the vest at the very foot of the silver strip on the back of the vest worn by PC Nicole Short. The characteristics of some of the soil from Area 1 from the silver strip of the vest worn by PC Nicole Short is consistent with having originated from soil from the toe at the welt of the right boot and from the soil from the heel of the sole of the right boot of Mr. Sheku Bayo.
What characteristics are you referring to?
That is the characteristics of the elemental compositional data and also the particle size and shape.
And when you say the characteristics of some of the soil, is that because there were 2 replicates within that soil sample that were different from the other 4?
That is correct. This can only be based on 4 replicates because 2 of the replicates were different, and likely because it was a mixture.
Let's move on to slide 41, please. Again, can I ask you to read this?
So again, this relates to the soil now at the top. Sorry, this is the soil from Area 1 at the foot of the silver strip, still the same area. This is Area 1. The characteristics of the soil from Area 1 from the silver strip of the vest worn by PC Nicole Short is not consistent with having originated from soil from the boots of PC Craig Walker.
And again, the characteristics will be the morphology as viewed under the microscope and also the relative compositional elemental analysis.
Both those aspects were different, yes.
Let's move on to slide 42. Again, Professor, can you share this conclusion with us?
We're now moving on to the middle of the 3 traces on the vest, that of Area 2, at the top of the silver reflective strip on the vest worn by PC Nicole Short. The characteristics of the soil from Area 2, from the silver strip near the edge of yellow fabric of the vest worn by PC Nicole Short, is not consistent with having originated from the boots of Mr. Sheku Bayo or from the boots of PC Craig Walker.
So should we understand then that the soil taken from Area 2 on the vest is different, both morphologically and in terms of the elemental profile from all of the footwear samples that you examined?
That is correct.
And that allows you to exclude the possibility that the soil on Area 2 of the vest shared a common origin with the soils on Mr. Bayo's boots.
Correct.
And you can similarly exclude the possibility that the soil on Area 2 shared a common origin with the soil on Constable Walker's boots.
That's correct.
Thank you. Can we move to slide 43, please? And this is your opinion in relation to the soil on the yellow fabric, that is Area 3. Again, can I invite you to share this conclusion with us?
So this is now the sample that came from the back of the vest of PC Nicole Short, and it's the material that came from the yellow fabric, Area 3. The characteristics of the soil from Area 3, from the yellow fabric of the vest worn by PC Nicole Short, is consistent with having originated from the soil from the toe of the sole of the left boot and soil from the heel of the sole of the right boot worn by Mr. Sheku Bayo.
Now, you brought it to my attention that it may be that there should have been a reference to another of the samples in this slide. Can you help me with that?
So I think that should include all 3 traces that came from Mr. Shekobayo's boot. So the heel of the sole of the right boot, but the toe of the sole of the left boot, plus the other trace from the left boot, were all consistent with having originated from the same soil as that of Area 3.
So that would be the welt of the left
That is correct.
boot. And it may be that I caused a little confusion because, of course, in your report, you use laboratory reference numbers for all of the samples, such as GAY 16 and GAY 17. And what I asked you to do in preparing the slide presentation was to call the items by their descriptive terminology. So I might have introduced a little confusion there, and I apologise if I did. Let's move on to slide 44, please. Again, can you share this conclusion with us?
So this again is the Area 3 on the yellow fabric. The characteristics of the soil from Area 3, from the yellow fabric of the vest worn by PC Nicole Short, is not consistent with having originated from the soil from the boots of PC Craig Walker.
So again, on the basis of the morphology and the elemental profiles that you have examined, you consider that you can exclude Constable Walker's boots as having been the source of the soil found on Area 3 of Nicole Short's vest, whereas you consider that the soil on Area 3 is consistent with having shared a common origin with 3 of the samples from Mr. Bayo's boots, as we saw in the previous slide.
That's correct.
I want to ask you just a few questions around the limitations of the analysis that you were able to carry out here. So you conclude that characteristics of the soil taken from both areas 1 and 3 of the vest are consistent with the soil having come from one or other of the samples taken from Mr. Bayo's boots.
That's correct.
Now, members of the public watching your evidence might wonder whether you're saying that the soil on areas 1 and 3 of the vest did come from Shekobayo's boots. Is that what you're saying?
I think we're saying that it's consistent with having come from there. We can't categorically say that it came from Mr. Bayo's boots. We can't link one specific soil trace to another. We can only comment on the characteristics of those traces. It's not a categoric science, it's a probabilistic science. And that's why we use statistics to give likelihoods and probabilities as to whether a soil came from a particular place or not.
And again, members of the public watching your evidence might wonder whether you can offer a view as to how likely it is that the soil in areas 1 and 3 came from Mr. Bayo's boots. Is that something that you're able to do?
You can calculate what are called likelihood ratios. So the likelihood of the soil on the vest having come from Mr. Bayo's boots, but that requires the alternative proposition and alternative data to do that likelihood ratio calculation. And in this case, we didn't have that database. We didn't have that wider data that would allow us to calculate likelihoods.
So again, the most that you can say is that the soil from areas 1 and 3 on the vest is consistent with having come from Mr. Bayo's boots.
That's correct.
Just a few final questions before we conclude. We spoke earlier about the best practice manual to which you were a contributing author. Was all of the work that you carried out in connection with this case carried out in accordance with the best practice set out in the manual?
Yes, it was.
I'd like to turn to your report. There's no need to put this on screen. You may wish to have the hard copy before you, Professor. It's page 13 of your report. And it's under a section headed Transfer and Persistence, which we've already touched on. Do you have that?
Yes.
At the top of page 13, you say the main factors that determine the transfer and persistence of soil are length of time after the contact, nature of contact surface, amount of force and duration of contact, and external disturbances following contact. And you quote a paper there, Stella et al. 2020. Soil transfer is typically more effective when soils are wet and saturated. And you quote another paper, Proctor et al. 2019. Now, we've spoken about transfer and persistence already, and we've spoken about the nature of the contact surface. In particular, the fabric of the vest comprised both a woven fabric and a plastic-coated high-vis strip. We've spoken about that to an extent already, but I note that in quoting this paper, you make reference to the amount of force as being a relevant consideration and a factor that will be in the mix in terms of determining the transfer and persistence of soil. You offered a view earlier in your evidence that the plastic reflective strip would perhaps not be the best or the most adhesive surface for the transfer of soil. And you also observed that so far as the soil in Area 3, that was on the yellow woven fabric of the vest, was concerned, you described that soil as being embedded or ingrained. And this may not be a question that you can answer, and please tell me if you can't, but can you comment at all on the degree of force that would be required for a transfer onto a woven surface that would result in the soil becoming embedded or ingrained within the weave of the fabric?
That particular area of transfer to different fabrics, I personally haven't carried out much research in that area at all or published in it, but other people have, and the literature would suggest that it requires a fair degree of force. Now, I don't know, and I can't quote the amount of force, but the literature would suggest that it requires a force for soil to transfer and embed within fabric. But I personally cannot give you any opinion on that because I myself haven't carried out that research.
That's very fair. Can you bear with me a moment, please? I have no further questions. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Now, there were no written Rule 9 applications. Are there any oral ones? No. Well, thank you very much, Professor Dawson, for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. In a moment, I shall be adjourning and you'll be free to go. Now, we adjourn until Thursday, is that right, Ms. Graham?
Yes, that's correct. We'd anticipated that perhaps we would need extra time with Professor Dawson. That's not proved to be the case, so we don't have any witnesses scheduled for
Very
tomorrow.
well, I'll adjourn until Thursday at 10 o'clock.